Okay, it is now 2 o'clock, and so I resume the hearing. I would say, look, as I'm going around the table and taking points, if I was generous, I'd say that certain themes are developing. If I was less generous, I'd say that it's becoming repetitive. I'm in less generous mood. So, look, you know, if the point that you wanted to make has been made by someone else, frankly, I don't need to hear it. Again, it is a point that we will take into account. I think, Mr. Lyons, before we broke for lunch, I said that we would come back to the council to reply on those things we've just heard before I continue my journey around the table.
Yes, thank you, sir. Just before I do that, Ms Hubbard has just come up to me and mentioned that she understands Selby, the executive member at Selby, has emailed to indicate that a note had been sent to you in relation to the HMA issue. We're not sure that would have arrived with you yet, sir. Obviously, you haven't mentioned anything, but I think you haven't received anything for the programme officer? Or?
I'm not saying I haven't received it. If I have, I haven't looked at it.
Right, okay. We'll look into this at our end, and to the extent that Selby are raising any additional matters beyond those that are in the hearing statements, we'll discuss it with them and update you as part of our homework list, sir. And as we're doing that, we will make sure that the original point about the correspondence from confirming members involved in duty cooperate discussions is picked up as well. Thank you. I'll ask Mr. Wood to deal with some responses, please.
Thank you. Firstly, I just wanted to really re-emphasise the point made at the beginning, just in terms of the work that's been done with site promoters and developers to give accurate delivery rates to make sure that the trajectory reflects that. Clearly, we will continue to work with developers and promoters to update the trajectory, and I guess being open, recognise that that could work both ways in terms of the updates, in terms of the figures could also be improved. I think what it would be helpful is if we look at a longer trajectory to do that and include the additional years that have clearly been subject of discussion. Just on other sort of points that have been raised, I guess just want to stress that clearly we need to look at paragraph 85 of the framework. That needs to be read alongside paragraph 157 with the terminology there of preferably a 15-year period. So there is sort of some flexibility between those periods in terms of what you make provision for. We do want to stress, we've covered this already in terms of the work that has been done on site allocations. Clearly through that process that has sought to make those allocations consistent with the overall approach and the strategy and the spatial principles. And I think clearly the point has come out that very much we feel that the approach for seeking allocations gives you greater certainty in moving forward. In terms of the issue of how far you look ahead, I think it is clear that there isn't anything in policy that gives you the answer to that, and there isn't a uniform approach, and clearly I won't go back over the discussion we've had and the points raised on that. I think they recognise the point around a minimum requirement, but I guess there needs some practicality around that. I guess if you took that to an extreme, you would never have any headroom on that basis. So clearly in terms of looking forward, we do need to have some basis for do that, and there's a sort of matter of judgment around that. I think in terms of, again, back to the sort of the period after, or at the end of the actual plan period, the council's position is it's most important to look at the overall supply as to what you have at that point in time, not exactly what you have in each year of the plan period when it's beyond, or it's in the years beyond the plan period. So clearly we're sort of making the point around the over provision and the overall supply. Probably just a little bit back to that certainty point. There, I think, is what has come out in terms of the point that was that made helpfully by you, say, in terms of the process for bringing forward safeguarded land is through a local plan review process. I think we very much feel that a key aspect of certainty is all around delay and sort of timescale. So clearly going through a local plan review process is relatively, compared to an allocations route, is going to take more time. And we just wanted to flag on the employment land and the reference to the addendum at paragraph 7.42 that there is the last sentence in there that references the 2 additional years of supply of employment land. Thank you.
2 additional years beyond 2038 at paragraph 7.42, sir. And just 2 very short extra points from me. The trajectory, the best reference, sir, I referred to EXCYC 11A. The correct reference should have been EXCYC 16, because that relates specifically to the 790 DPA. It was a later trajectory. CYC 16. It's the SHLA figure 6 updated to 790 DPA, and that gives the total figures of over provision at the end of the plan period. And as Mr. Wood indicated, I think a point was raised about the trajectory being wrong. In reality, what might happen best is for the trajectory to be extended beyond 2038, so it's clear how we see the additional supply as at 2038 panning out over a longer period. Just pick up very briefly on reference to Mr. Hobson's opinion. I think Mr. Natkus made the point that, well, he accepts that as a generality, allocations can be used as a way forward, and he also accepted that under that opinion, Mr. Hobson identified that approach as a proper way out of any potential issues relating to safeguarding. I'd also ask you to note, sir, that without going into the opinion in detail now, it's EXCYC 11A. Mr. Hobson was primarily looking at options which didn't start with the allocations that are now proposed by the plan. He was considering options that basically involved leaving land unallocated, remaining in the green belt, or being designated as safeguarded land. So his primary focus of the opinion wasn't actually looking at the allocations options that the council is pursuing. And in any event, he emphasised that the length of time that one was looking at beyond the plan period was ultimately a question of judgment. And for the reasons we've given, we say that the approach taken is appropriate. Finally, on the points dealing with the Gypsy and Traveller provision, Mr. Pittam, I'm not going to repeat what we said yesterday, because really this, we say, is a phase 2 matter. There are various options for dealing with any arguments that the policies as they stand do not adequately make provision for Gypsy and Traveller and show people's needs. The provision that's made in the policy makes allowances for sites on strategic sites. And as I mentioned yesterday, we are prepared to look at tightening up aspects of the policy to ensure that any needs that are alleged to be unmet can be dealt with through exceptions policy, or even through a tightening of how provision is made on strategic sites. So we don't think there's a need to safeguard in that sense. Thank you very much, sir.
Mr. Willis.
Thank you, sir. I will keep this brief because I think a lot of the points have been covered in one way or another, but just to pick on a few points that haven't quite been covered. We earlier heard about the difficulties surrounding consideration of safeguarded land. Echo the points of everyone else. Indeed, we've submitted vision documents and everything else to demonstrate that they are deliverable. Just to draw a distinction and be absolutely clear on this, the NPPF does not say because something's difficult you shouldn't do it. I think you still need to do it whether it's difficult or not, just to be absolutely clear on that. And I dispute that it is difficult. Looking at the other matters in terms of well beyond the plan period, I talked about this yesterday, and I'll draw you, sir, to paragraphs 311 to 318 of my statement, which talks about housing numbers and various other things. I covered the point yesterday. We don't need to rehearse it now. It's largely been covered by others as well. But just to pick up on something Mr. Wood mentioned there, which I was going to mention earlier as well, paragraph 157 of the framework, which I don't think has been mentioned before now. He drew us rightly to the second bullet point, which says preferably a 15-year time horizon. If we can just look at the whole of paragraph 157, which starts with crucially, local plans should, which crucially is pretty definitive. I admit that the bullet point does say preferably, be drawn up over an appropriate timescale. I think we've heard quite a bit earlier in terms of the length of time it's taken to get to even this position in York and what is an appropriate time frame for York's local plan. I would submit, sir, that 15 years is at least what we need to be looking at, both for this plan period and the next plan period. And then drawing that to a close, then we go back to 85, I think it's fifth bullet point. After we've talked about well beyond the plan period, we say satisfy themselves that Greenbelt boundaries will not need to be altered at the end of the plan period. I think given everything we've heard today, that basically there's very little industrial land in York. We talked about the chocolate sites are pretty easy to bring forward compared to the industrial sites of other cities in the north in particular. The vast amount of Greenbelt with barely any greenfield land that isn't Greenbelt. And the fact that, in my view, we need to be looking at least 13 years for longevity of the plan period. I just don't see where that land's going to come from. If we're sitting here saying 20 years, it will last for 22, 3, whatever we end up at, there's a long period. There's another 5, 6, 7, 8 years to be covered there that just aren't, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that's where the shortfall is, sir.
Mr. Wright.
Thank you, sir. I propose to answer the specific question about the plan identifying land between the urban area and the green belt. Firstly, I wish to make a comment about why it's more necessary now than when I set out my arguments in the response. And that is in consequence of the outcome of the Oakham case at Guildford. I have previously said, and it remains the case, that in putting to the EIP any points, I'm doing so under the RTPI protocol, so to maintain the weight against which you may give my remarks, I need to tell you that I did seek advice on this matter from Richard Harwood QC, who was one of the counsel in the Oakham case, but I have not as yet received it. And according to the views I'm now going to express about the Oakham case are mine and not supported by learned counsel's view. My point about the Oakham case is that it has established really that it's made the point that if you want to establish exceptional circumstances, it is now easier than it was. And therefore, the threat to the permanence of a green belt, all green belts, has been increased. That increased threat justifies and increases the need for there to be safeguarded or white land to protect the permanence of this green belt. So that having been said, I would make a couple of points about the potential of the land in the location around the urban area being available. Firstly, as a response to Mr. Corsier's assertion that there is a limit to York's growth. So in my response, I delivered to you copies of 2 booklets produced, one by the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, a second by the Department of Environment, which described the circumstances of green belts across the country. And it indicated for Oxford that there was no room for any growth. At Cambridge, there was a foreseeable limit to the growth. And for York, it said that the Greenbelt needed to protect against urban sprawl, but did not indicate that there was any limit to its growth. So that is the evidence, and nothing has changed since that last booklet was produced, other than policy probably now encourages that the growth should occur adjacent to and immediately with the existing urban core under paragraph 84 of the MPPF. So secondly, I would comment about the evidence of the historic character assessment that you've got, which describes York as a compact city. This is a planning document in a planning process, and the word compact has a very specific meaning in town and country planning. The best example of a compact city within Europe is Paris. It's nothing to do with size. Compact is about urban form. So if the historic assessment, character assessment, is describing York as a compact city, it is, I think, slightly misplaced, because I've also supplied you with the Corin map, which is supervised by Sheffield University for the European Union. And that plots urban form across Europe. And in respect of York, at the main criteria for defining a compact city, there is less than 0.1% of the urban form that would fall into that category. So I say to you that the historic character assessment is significantly flawed. But thirdly, there is evidence before you from the University of Sheffield in their ECHUS report of 2000. And although that was 2 decades ago, Mr. Smith has indicated that the historic character of York hasn't changed. In fact, I would agree with that, and therefore that evidence is as good as any other evidence on this subject. And that
I'm very forgive me, Mr. Wright. I'm very eager to know how this plays into the question of safeguarded land.
Yeah, so it's into the point of safeguarded land between the urban area and the greenbelt, because in the ECHUS report it indicates that there are areas of the urban edge which do not reflect the historic character of York, and that if development were to occur at those points, it would be beneficial to the character of the historic character of York, because it could remove, as it were, the non-characteristic aspects and replace the appearance as you approach York with that historic character at all points. And in fact, I would go one step further than ECHUS and say, well, if you can do that where the character isn't appropriate and improve it, you can actually do it all the way around where there is development displaying the character of York, because all you're doing is enlarging it but keeping the overall impact the same. It doesn't matter that the city grows outwards, because the setting isn't impacted by that. the setting is the open land that surrounds it, and if you increased the development from the urban core outwards towards the inner ring road, it would not diminish the amount of open land within the 6-mile radius of the green belt that provides a suitable setting for the city. So I make one reference with regard to the alternative approach that the council put forward about allocations. My view is that if they went to allocations, they're likely to pursue the same line that they have with the allocations they've done, and have them dotted about, and some out in the green belt and some here and there, like a dog's breakfast, if I might say. And it would be much better if the safeguarded land were allocated adjacent to the existing edge of the urban area and out towards the green belt. It would ensure that not only was the boundaries of the green belt preserved for the future, but the character of York could be preserved by continuing to develop there in a characteristic and appropriate manner. Thank you.
Mr. Corsia.
Thank you, sir. I'm not going to go on the merits of safeguarded land because I would simply be repeating Historic England's comments and the danger that might create for the character and setting, sir. I would just remind you that, of course, in our submission, there's a finite amount of developable land in sustainable locations. So can I just come on to a couple of points which were raised by Mr. Linus earlier? Because some of this may be clarification, sir, which I could ask from you. When we started this morning, Mr. Linus, his position started as being there was enough housing available. Yes, the housing would cater for needs up to 2041, and which I accept, sir, on the basis of figures. Somehow, under probing from you, that figure, 2041, suddenly seemed to be a point where the plan would make provision for as a target. I think that was the case. Unless we have, I'm not certain, so whether we move from 2038, which is what the plan is seeking to cater for, to 2041, and even seemed to go further that we were going to see a main modification to that effect. So can I just ask if I've misunderstood?
No, there was never going to be a main modification. The modification that was talked about was one to confirm that the plan period ended in 2033, and the debate over 2038 and 2041 was the time scale within which the council said there would be housing supply available to ensure the permanence of the green belt boundary. And the 2041 figure, the 2041 date came from adding 2.5 years onto the 2038 time period on the trajectory, judging from the additional supply that was in the trajectory at 2038. So there wasn't any main modification dealing with the time frame for the plan.
So I'm grateful for that. So we are now staying with the 2038 as being the lifespan of
33.
Sorry, 2033 for the plan period, but 2038 for the life of the green belt, as set out.
No, the life of the life of the green belt has been put in terms of us saying that there is sufficient land to endure beyond the plan period for at least 5 years to 2038, probably more given the supply figures taking up to 2041. But it was presented initially as at least 5 years, but probably more.
So I'm grateful for that. I was just trying to get clarification in relation to paragraph 313 of the submitted plan, which refers to 2038. The plan providing...
This is where we started. This is where the confusion over the time period of the plan began. And the main modification is going to confirm that the plan period is to 2033.
So I'm grateful for that clarification. Can I then deal with the second substantive point, is the question of allocations, whether you should have allocations or safeguarded land if you were indeed minded to go along that route, and I obviously would use the word if. So we would say that you would first of all have to note that currently the plan has no phasing whatsoever for housing allocations, as far as I can see. So that could mean if a land were to be allocated, it could be taken up very rapidly. And so we say that that isn't compatible with the fact that there is only a finite amount of developable land here around York. And so we would go further than that. We would say it would be to allocate land to 2038, or would be contrary to MPPF paragraph 49, sir, third bullet point, which actually states allocation should only be made for the period 11 to 15, not beyond 15. We fully accept, sir, that the point that large allocations can run over that period, can go on the plan period, but sir, you shouldn't be making allocations specifically for the post-year 15 period. We would say that would be contrary to the MPPF. And that's all, sir. It was very brief, hopefully.
Thank you, Mr. Corsia. Mr. Grundy.
Thank you. I think by the time it gets around to me, I seem to always end up with 3 points to make. So following that theme, pursuant to Mr. Wright's comments just now, and something that occurred to me after, my comments in respect of the extreme sensitivity approach to historic assets. I think the council, by saying everything out to the outer field boundaries for the district is a historic asset, actually reduces the weight to be attached to the real historic assets that really need protecting. Going back to safeguarded land and the points of discussion between yourself and Mr. Butler, I think it was, I was going to raise concerns about not having any safeguarded land because of problems that the problems of it taking more time to deliver than other potential. Well, an easy answer to that is, if you're concerned about timescales for delivery of safeguarded land development, well, part of the answer is to allocate more land, have more firm allocations that come on stream, and then you're adding to your buffer against under-delivery of other sites. You've got more of a safeguard, more of a fallback than safeguarded land will actually provide you. And finally, a few around the table, and following the words of Ms. Cook, are suggesting that the best way to give you safeguards and give you additional flexibility is to extend the large strategic sites. But as I previously noted, this would result in even more eggs being crammed into that basket of strategic sites.
Mrs. Oldfield.
Thank you. I'd just like to pick up on a point that Ms. Hubbard made in relation to healthcare need, and I will try to be as brief as possible. I appreciate that we've been discussing ensuring that the plan allows for a period in relation to the Greenbelt up to 2041. And my client's land interest falls within the wider Retreat Hospital site, for which Mr. Proctor presented our shared concerns yesterday. And in line with this, our hearing statement wholly agrees with the requirement for safeguarded land to manage both future uncertainty and allow for flexibility. However, I think the critical element here is that of development need, and we've spoken at length today about need for housing, employment and education. But I think on behalf of my client, it's important that we highlight healthcare need, and it was something that Ms. Hubbard brought up. I've got a client who's seeking to invest in York now and has a current need, but they've been forced to consider a site within the Greenbelt. And this is even before, as we are doing now, considering the plan period, and then even beyond up to 2041. So this illustrates that existing need isn't met, and therefore, arguably, safeguarded land and allocated land is critical to ensure that the Greenbelt boundary and the associated safeguarded land is drawn in line with the assessment of need. Thank you.
Mr. Tucker.
I have, sir, a very small point to make, you'll be pleased to hear. So my excitement about education needs was expressed by you implicitly to Mr. Linus earlier on, sir. Just mindful that we're about to finish the phase 1 part of the examination. So I don't want you to be left with the impression that my client's case relates solely in relation to education. I draw particular attention to EC1, where my clients are identified as providing the largest single employment allocation across East Campus and the expansion land, ST17, related to the knowledge-based industry and the future economic base of the city. So my point doesn't just relate to education needs, it's the wider employment needs and all that which comes with the university expansion and potential science parks, etc. That's really the only point I wanted to make, sir. And I think Mr. Linus has already explained the dissonance between the 2038 figure, which is within the addendum and is also to be found within the recent justification to EC1. But that takes us to 2040. We've had the figure of 2041. And obviously, we have the information about expansion to 2033 when it comes to the university. I think there's some rationalisation that needs to be done behind the scenes in the interim period. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Keogh.
Thank you, sir. Just 3 very quick points. Firstly, in relation to your point that, of course, safeguarded land has to go through a local plan review before it can, the development can go forward. Clearly, there is a timescale implication there, but nearly not as long a timescale implication as there would be if you were reviewing Greenbelt and having to show exceptional circumstances, and particularly in the case of York, where the whole issue of the historic character and setting of the city would once again open up if you were looking to review Greenbelt. So the safeguarded route would be by far the quicker route. Second point, some may already have made this, but I'm not sure it was made strongly enough. If you were wondering whether the council would have to start afresh to look for sites to safeguard, there are clearly quite a few sites or allocations, safeguarding or allocations. People have already mentioned there were sites that were in the 2013 plan that were taken out that have already been through the assessment, but also so have omission sites such as the site we're putting forward has been through an assessment now and was indeed recommended as a potential allocation back in the January 2018 local plan working group. So there's not, the council aren't starting from ground zero. They have quite a bank of sites to consider. And third point is just in terms of the latter stages of the not the latter stage of the plan, the period following the plan period where you're looking at allocations to meet need and essentially fulfill the requirement to have a permanent Greenbelt boundary. The only issue there is you're looking at a decreasing number of sites to deliver most of the requirement. So it's the all the eggs being in one basket or a very limited number of baskets point that the flexibility reduces the further you get beyond 2033 in terms of the number of sites that you have to deliver the housing requirement. Thank you.
Mrs. Hubbard.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, but I think I do have to qualify the answer I gave to you about whether the plan should have safeguarded land in. And what I should have said is if Greenbelt is going to be treated as a residual policy, yes, there is a need for safeguarded land. If, however, the council were to review its approach or you were to recommend that it should review its approach so that the Greenbelt didn't include land that isn't necessary to be kept permanently open, then of course there would be no need for safeguarded land. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unless there's anything else, I'm going to ask the council for its final response. Very good. Mr. Linus.
some very short points from me. First of all, Mr. Tucker's points noted, we can pick that up. It really is a phase 2 issue in the sense that we can address it through the phase 2 hearings. Mr. Keogh's point, I think our point is that the proper comparisons between the allocations that we're proposing now versus the delay that would be realised if you safeguarded land and subject to review 5 years down the line. And that's why we say the certainty of allocations now is the better option. That's the correct comparison to make, not the one that he was making. As for the point about the number of sites, again, we say the proper thing to look at is the number of units and the overall provision and supply that would be achieved as at the end of the plan period, and the oversupply that would exist, whether or not that comes from a few sites or many. We say the proper approach is to look at the units. I think Mr. Wood had a couple of points.
Just on the issue of, I guess, the historic character assessment being flawed, and it doesn't matter if the city grows outwards. I think that the implication of that is that the heritage topic paper, the heritage impact appraisal, and the views of historic England that have shaped and fed into that, the implication is that that's all flawed. Clearly our position is the opposite, that we feel they are robust and up-to-date evidence documents, and clearly they do tell you that it does matter if the city just grows outwards, because that has the most harm, and I think we've probably covered that quite a number of times, but just really wanted to stress that. And just, I guess, back to the MPPF, I sort of got to, it sort of neither tells you to safeguard or tells you not to safeguard. I think that's sort of the general point to make on that. Thank you.
Thank you. For that, well, by my reckoning, then that puts to bed and completes issues questions 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, 3.4, and 3.5.
And 3.6, sir.
Yeah. It's okay. It's okay. And 3.6. So let us go then to the approach to identifying land to be, in inverted commas, released from the green belt for development. That's question 3.7.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to ask Ms Cook to summarise the Council's position, if that's acceptable.
As we've previously explained, the Council think that there is an alignment has been adopted between the Green Belt purposes and the spatial strategy is confirmed in section 4 of the TP1 Green Belt Addendum, which, as we've set out, is EXCYC 18. The same spatial principles which were aligned with GB purposes in TP1 were also used as part of the site selection process. This was done in particular in the Preferred Sites Consultation 2016, which is SD018, which took into account the relevant aspects of Greenbelt policy when deciding whether or not sites should proceed to allocation. I have some example wording which I'm just going to illustrate that point, which is following further technical officer consideration of the site, it is considered that the site performs an important role in maintaining a green wedge into York from Monkstray, which contributes to the setting of York. Maintaining green wedges is a key characteristic of York and an important role of York's green belt. The site is not contained to the north and eastern boundaries, opening onto agricultural fields to the northern boundary, providing access to open countryside. I'm trying not to stray into site-specific matters, but to illustrate the point of the wording that we've been used. This linkage is confirmed in Table 1 as set out in the Greenbelt topic paper TP1. And again, Greenbelt policy was taken into account at the pre-publication consultation stage in 2017 and presented as Annex B to the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment 2017, which is SD054. Each of the strategic purposes of the Greenbelt policy align in Section 4 of the TP1 addendum and are therefore being permeated through the site selection process. The alignment of these methodologies, we feel, directs development away from areas considered to be kept permanently open and directed to less sensitive areas. Some sites deselected or not selected for reasons other than specifically relate to reasons other. Some sites deselected or not selected for reasons other than specifically related to Greenbelt, but some were specifically disregarded in terms of on Greenbelt terms. Those sites that remained were then assessed in Annex 5 to the topic paper 1 addendum. And given the points above, the analysis in Annex 5 can be seen in the context of the site selection process set out in the preferred sites consultation and the strategic housing land availability assessment.
So I think one of the questions refers to ST7 and ST8 in particular. Should we explain the approach that was taken to those sites as a part of a roundup of 3.7? I think you can summarise that, please, Ms Cook.
Taking ST7 first, the site was previously included in the publication draft as strategic site. ST7, we have looked at it, and it was, this is at the 2014 stage. So with a total site area of 113 hectares and a total site capacity of 1,800 dwellings, of which 1,205 would be delivered in the planned period. Following the preferred sites consultation, the site area was reduced to 34.5 hectares with an estimated capacity of 845 dwellings. The site was pulled away from the existing urban edge of Heworth Without. Meadlands and Oswaldwick create a separate identifiable community, and the eastern edge of the site was also pulled away further from the A64 in order to protect key views of the Minster. And it was considered that the proposed allocation fits well with the urban form of York, consisting of the main urban areas surrounded by smaller villages. This is based upon our reconsideration of evidence in terms of the heritage topic paper and the characteristics within that in relation to the compactness of the city and landscape and setting. And we have demonstrated that and provided that in technical officer reports at each stage that we have looked through. In terms of how we've then looked at the Greenbelt purposes at each of those stages, we have said at the preferred sites consultation stage in our technical officer report for this site that the site is partially contained by two strong hedge boundaries and tree boundaries to the west of the eastern boundary. An outgang lane is established as the low tree level boundary. There are important views of the Minster from this part of the city, particularly along Bad Barnet Lane, further to the east, and the site master plan should be protecting the views. This boundary, in comparison to others, reduces the potential for any development to erode the identity of each area through extension and loss of distinctive boundaries, and open space given that it incorporates green wedges between the existing settlement edge and any new development. And the master planning should ensure that a standalone settlement forms a clearly identifiable community from the standalone area. And this fits with the principles and characteristics set out in the heritage topic paper under characteristic 2, compactness, and 2.5, which distinctly talks about identifiable compact districts. In terms of the green wedge, we talk about there's a reduction in the impact of development on the rural character, and that any such scheme must incorporate appropriate buffering.
Just confirm that when you're looking at ST7 and ST8, Ms Cook, Annex 5, what was the approach followed in Annex 5 to the site releases? What extent did the Greenbelt purposes form part of the assessment for ST7 and ST8?
In terms of ST7, when assessed in Annex 5 of the TP1 addendum, we identified that there was minor/significant harm to purpose 4, which is... this was in relation to applying that evidence base. We acknowledge...
In terms of the methodology, Ms Sheldon, the methodology that was followed when looking at ST7 and ST8, sir, for your note, ST7 appears at Annex 5.2, 5.3 and ST8, A 5.5 and 5.7. And when you look through the assessment of those strategic sites, they contain a summary of the exceptional circumstances.
My apologies, Ms Lyons.
Yes.
Can't hear you awfully well. That's because there are a number of microphones turned on.
Sorry, sir. Yes, the Annex 5 assessments of these sites specifically have assessment under the exceptional circumstances heading, the need to promote sustainable patterns of development, each of the green belt purposes, as well as detailed boundary issues. And the general proposition that the Council would make is that that approach is being plainly based on applying the fundamentals of Greenbelt policy, and various considerations are set out in the detail which bear in mind the need for openness and permanence when setting the boundaries of those sites. So in a global answer to your questions on 3.7, the site selection process has taken into account the same spatial principles which are reflected in the Greenbelt assessment work. That has occurred at various stages of the site selection process, where sites may have been rejected on grounds related to Greenbelt purposes, but have also been rejected on Greenbelt grounds generally as well. And that selection process has included all sites, not just those that were rejected, but those which fed through into the Annex 5 assessment. So at every stage, Greenbelt policy has been taken into account. And then when it comes to the individual sites...
My apologies, when
yes,
you
sir.
say all sites...
Yes, all sites that were considered through the SHLA process, and that is confirmed in the documents that Ms Cook referred you to. The preferred sites consultation paper from 2016, it's SD 018. And then the pre-publication consultation 2017, which is an Annex B to the SHLA, it's SD 54. And then that has fed through into the assessment that I've just identified in Annex 5 to the topic paper 1 addendum. So I think the fundamental point is that the wider aspects of Greenbelt policy have been fed into the site selection process, and Annex 5 is the result in terms of the sites that are proposed for alterations to the Greenbelt. And that specifically refers to Greenbelt purposes as well. So that's the methodological approach. As Ms Cook identifies, there are examples within each of those documents which can illustrate that, but given that we're at sort of methodological stage, that's the broad approach that's been taken, sir. And the details for ST7 and ST8 are specifically in Annex 5.
Go on then, Mr. Corsia.
Thank you, sir. You took me by surprise there. Can I take you... I want first of all to deal with a point that I think we dealt with last week. It's how the council has... What sites has the council actually considered and how far there's been... If you remember, the council said at one point, when I was asking them questions, there had been a dual approach. One, they looked at sites which have been sent to them by developers, and secondly, they were looking at sites which they themselves came up with. If you remember that, so it goes to how completely have they actually looked for sites. And so, can I take you? And this is where you've caught me by surprise to the SHLA 2018, it's SD 0498. And so you can see there, which sets out, this is entitled Methodology Developing Our Approach to Site Selection. And so that...
Sorry, Mr. Creasy, what was that reference, please?
It is the SD 049A.
A, right, thank you.
It's the main report accompanying the SHLA. The same, I think the same wording applies in many of the documents. And you'll see they've considered three types of sites. One site submitted through the Call for Sites, which is clearly in accord with planning practice guidance. I take no point on that. Extent housing and employment planning permissions and former allocations which have not been developed out. There's no fourth category of sites which they have thought may be appropriate. And so that's the council's own evidence. And so we say, sorry, I turned that off too quickly. We say that's insufficient. And so we consider that the whole council site selection process has been inadequate because it hasn't been there hasn't been a full consideration of potential sites and their impacts, or indeed the harm which the sites themselves, the selected sites, would cause. And this is because, sir, they didn't assess primarily Greenbelt properly at the outset of this process. So all the reference to TP1 and TP1 addendums are very good, sir. But you need to note that those documents were produced post-publication. The council had already taken their decisions on which sites they were going to form the submitted plan. And so we would say to you that if the council had done the Greenbelt purpose exercise properly at the outset, which is the parcel by parcel consideration, which other authorities have done. I was heavily involved in, for example, the Knowsley core strategy, which based its Greenbelt releases on the basis of a plan like that, on a study of that nature. So if they'd done that properly, they would not have come up with this list of sites. So because even if you take figure 7, sir, and I go back to figure 7, once they actually have done this exercise.
So is that the now infamous figure 7?
Yes, sir, the figure 7 of the addendum. Clearly, sir, we say that has major faults for which have been espoused by myself and others in this around this table. Namely, it doesn't pick up on the merits of the importance of the green buffer around the on the inside of the outer ring road, and secondly, it doesn't recognise the importance of the open countryside. But even taking those points, sir, that plan is showing you large areas which the council says are not important to be kept permanently open, but which are now included in the green belt, and certainly which are not allocated for development. In comparison, sir, it shows particularly ST14 and ST15, which are shown as lying within areas to be kept permanently open, which are allocated for development. And so this also goes back to really the point that has of how well has the historic character been assessed. And so Mr. Linus seems to take pride in the fact that 417, paragraph 417 of the addendum, only identifies the most important areas for the special character and setting. We say if this exercise was to be done properly, it should identify all the areas. And without identifying all the areas, then again the process is deficient. So another major failing of this exercise is that it takes absolutely no account of the impacts of off-site infrastructure. So we will go into this at a lot, if we get to phase 2, sir, then off-site infrastructure is very important in terms of ST15, as you'll probably have picked up. It not only requires a major new road through the green belt, but also a major new grade-separated junction onto the A64. And I will come back to that when I talk about deliverability and viability. And so those impacts have not been assessed. You will find no reference to them in Annex 5, sir, on that site. Indeed, if I could just read to you what Annex 5 says about it under ST15. The potential for negative...
I don't want to...
No, sir.
I know
this
it's
is just an illustration,
sir.
sir.
It's tempting for those with a penchant for certain sites to refer to them, and equally tempting for those that have contrary feelings about particular sites. But let us not dwell other than for illustrative purposes.
Well, sir, I'm using it as an illustration of the way in which the analysis the appraisal has not been fully done. I'm trying to pull out to you what the appraisal hasn't done, sir, and how it's been dealt with. It tells you that there is a potential for negative impacts from this junction, but it will be addressed through SBD site planning. So that is wholly deficient. This will have a major urbanising effect upon a large area of the Greenbelt, south-east of York. Probably as much as the development itself, but is not even to praise by this study. I'm sure my colleague on the left may well say the same thing about ST14. So there is obviously deliverability and viability should be key to any strategy of allocation of sites. But sir, you'll see, again, I don't go to, I'll use example ST15, sir.
Yeah, I mean, again, as you now know well, Mr. Courtier, I will be looking at questions of deliverability and viability in excruciating detail in phase 2. Yes, sir, but I want to draw out to you the point how much this has not been taken into account in the site selection process up to now. That's the point I'm trying to make, sir.
It's the new road and the grade separated junction, sir. We have there, sir, a major issue in terms of viability. As a point I made yesterday, that has not been assessed, despite the fact that you are talking about an abnormal cost. We don't know, but the IDP gives a provisional figure of £17 million, which would need to be incurred before you actually build one house. But what we do know now from the Statement of Common Ground is that that cost is yet to be even looked at with Highways England. And so, again, on deliverability, sir, of that site, you'll have noted the Statement of Common Ground with Highways England that they have not agreed, even in principle, sir, that a DMRB compliant junction can be created at that point. Those, sir, are such fundamental matters of principle, emphasise principle. These are matters for the local plan, not for the development control system, sir, that you have no confidence at this stage on deliverability. And indeed, it goes so far because this allocation is so fundamental to the plan, it comes to the question of whether there's been a duty to cooperate with Highways England. So. And so can I just finally, turning to a broader point, so when you are proposing 2 new settlements in a large area like York, one would expect at the very least the council to look at all the potential alternatives, at least at a in principle basis. As far as I can tell, there's absolutely no documentary evidence to say that the council has done anything more than accept I think two of the 3 proposed new settlements have been put to them by developers. And so that is not adequate. It is really, the council should have done a proper site selection exercise, looking at constraints and all the other matters before they selected sites in such a sensitive area such as York. And indeed, so when you look at the history of ST15, what you'll find is that obviously there was a larger proposal called Winthorpe, which was selected by the council in the earlier drafts of the plan. And so due to political opposition, that was moved backwards away from the A64 and to where its current position is, where as far as I'm aware, there's not even a developer promoter for the whole site. I'm not certain what Langwith's position, as I've read Langwith's submission, is that they are not promoting the site as allocated, but as proposed to be amended as an emission site. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Mrs. Worthington.
Thank you, sir. Keeping it specifically off-site specific details.
Very good, grateful.
If we accept there's a consensus that we need specialist exceptions to allow development in the Greenbelt, paragraph 84 of the MPPF recommends that councils make sure that development is sustainable. Mrs. Cook very helpfully provided us with evidence that garden settlements need to be in the region of 1,500 to 10,000 houses to be self-sufficient in any form. And the council have also been very helpful in identifying places where there's insufficient access to transport or services. They have also identified places where development needs to be prevented in order to avoid urban sprawl. even though those aren't on any of the Greenbelt maps. It follows, in my logic, that if a site falls outside the areas where access is available, and it's below the size where it is going to be a self-sustaining settlement in any form, the local authority are failing to provide, meet the requirements of paragraph 84 in proposing sustainable development. Thank you.
Councillor Waters.
Thank you. Thank you, Inspector. Just in relation to some of the concerns that Mr Corsier had over methodology and process, I'd just like to say that from my experience, which is now many years now within the council, sites are picked politically and officers are then charged with justifying those selections. And in reference to the newspaper that I gave you last week, Inspector, I'd just like to read one paragraph from it before I start. Since local government reorganisation created the unitary authority that is City of York Council in 1996, control of the council has repeatedly changed hands from Labour to the Liberal Democrats to a hung council and back to Labour again, and since 2015, a hung council once more. Different political groups have had wildly different views on what should be in the plan. For example, how many new homes York needs. So every time the authority has changed hands, it has been back to square one with a new intake of local politicians undoing much of the work that has been done on the plan by the previous administration. I won't get any more...
I think there you criticised politicians of all colours, and on that basis, I see that as being a politically neutral point.
I'm an independent, just for clarity, Inspector. What I've quite often described the situation in York is political hokey-cokey as regards the Greenbelt. Whether it's in, out or it's shecking about depends on who's actually pulling the strings at the time. But some things that don't change, and I'd like to read out this reference from Inspector Shepherd. It might have been played to death this morning, I wasn't here, but if it has, please stop me. The booklet, The Greenbelts 1988, states that the main purpose of the York Greenbelt is to safeguard the special character of the historic city, which might be endangered by unrestricted expansion. Bearing in mind the national and international fame of importance of York, I can see no reason to anticipate any significant change or derogation from this aim in future. I do not consider that this special character is only related to the walled city or even just to the green wedges extending almost to that walled city. It relates more to the more general size and character of York. Even from the top of the Minster Tower, the countryside around York can barely be seen, other than the parts of the green wedges. Since the construction of the Ring Road, views from that road are of a special significance, particularly when they include views of the Minster, which define thereby the location of the city centre and indicate the general scale and character of York. I consider that in general there will be serious harm to views of the city from the Ring Road if development were permitted to come right up to the latter, and even more so if it passed beyond it. Now, I listened to the council position as regards ST7, and I'm concerned as to how specific I can be in my comments to that at this stage, but I'm only a simple soul, Inspector, and when I read that in an inspector's report from 25 years ago, and with specific reference to the area of land that is ST7, when I also read this from another inspector, the objection site lies within a broad swathe of open countryside on the eastern side of the city, lying between the built-up area and the Ring Road. This countryside is characterised by fields and hedgerows and forms a pleasant and important landscape setting for the historic city. This countryside setting is particularly evident in views from the Ring Road. The objection site, which is now ST7, occupies a substantial part of this swathe of open countryside, and its development would be a serious encroachment into the countryside which would adversely affect the setting of the city. Encroachment into the countryside in this area would undermine the objectives of Greenbelt policy and would not be overcome by landscaping any development on the site. As I say, I'm a simple soul. What has changed in the last 25 years? The Minster's still in the same place. The views from the ring road, looking across ST7, are not only the same, I would venture they're more important now, because as you travel further around the A64, you'll find that other views of the Minster have been compromised by, shall we say, inappropriate development that's been allowed around Monk's Cross. There's an absolutely huge community stadium now that really detracts from the views of the Minster. If you go further along the 1237, initially when Inspector Shepherd wrote his conclusions 25 years ago, there were some fleeting glimpses of the Minster. Most of those have been lost by other developments around, again, Monk's Cross, Clifton Moor, and the landscape growth around the 1237. The very iconic view stretching across ST7 off the A64 has become even more important in the intervening years. And what particularly amuses me is reminiscing back to the 2006 public inquiry into Derwentthorpe, was the council's position at the time, which I'm sure Mr Corsier remembers well, that Metcalfe Lane was an endurable, defendable greenbelt boundary. That was when the council was trying to secure development of its own land to the land west of Metcalfe Lane, and that was as far as development would go. The council were actually promoting those views of Inspector Shepherd as part of their reasoning at that inquiry. And what did we find when the council had got planning permission and the money in the bank for that land? The first emergence of Search Area B, as it was at the time, which is now morphed into ST7. And I mention that inquiry because there was a very, very useful piece at the time, which I think was briefly touched on in a different way from a Heritage England representative this morning, from what I heard from another participant. And I'd just like to read 2 paragraphs and then I'll leave you. Now, this was put in by English Heritage at the time in 2006 into that public inquiry. The implication which derives from the primary purpose of the York Greenbelt is that in order to protect the setting and special character of the historic city, at some time in the future, there may potentially be a need to limit the further expansion of the city or to accommodate the future assessed development needs of the city in a means other than peripheral expansion. If this were not the case, then there would have been no need for an encircling greenbelt around the city. In order to ascertain at what point the special character or the setting of the city might be harmed, and therefore where a halt should be put upon the further growth of York, an assessment needs to be undertaken of the capacity of the historic city to accommodate further growth. Such an assessment should not just relate to what parts of York in visual terms are important to its setting and character, but should also extend to an evaluation of the effects which future development might have upon the other aspects which contribute to its special character. Again, very, very similar concerns to Mr Corsier over how this process has been carried out, most especially with regard to ST7. And if this process does go to stage 2 hearings, no doubt I'll be able to elaborate further at that time. Thank you, Inspector.
Thank you. Mr Grundy.
Thank you. And whilst I may stand to be accused of opportunism, but Councillor Waters' comments actually lead directly into what I was going to say. And of course, no views of the Minster exist from the York Outer Ring Road to the west of the city. The Greenbelt Review, as we've said previously, falls short as it has included no comparative assessment to guide where development could be directed to cause the least Greenbelt harm. Such an assessment could also give appropriate weight arising from the increased emphasis that the Council is guided to place on historic setting factors. So placing the extra emphasis on that one bullet point of the the way you look at the 5 purposes of green belts. Had such an assessment been done, the exclusion of the land to the west of the city would have been identified as preferable, leading to development options in a sustainable location being identified within a strong and permanent green belt boundary following the line of the outer ring road at this point. Thank you.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, sir. I do want to touch upon ST7 and ST8 very briefly, but only on the basis that they're actually in your questions, and therefore I possibly have the right just to go to them. And in doing so, I'd like to go to Annex 5. I don't necessarily want to go into the detail because I've got a funny feeling that we're going to be repeating all of this conversation when we get to the Phase 2, Stage 2 hearings. And I don't know, sir, how far you want me to go even now, because I'm actually minded to think we can probably save this on the bulk of it to the Stage 2.
I suspect that that's right. Really, I want to focus on methodology today.
I think there is a weakness in the methodology, but I think I have to go, in particular with ST8, where ultimately, having just been through the annex, and we don't need to go to it, but the annex tells me that the only reason why I've got a green belt between ST8 and the urban edge is actually to provide for a green wedge, which is not the same as green belt, and the green wedge is to protect the setting of Huntington Village as opposed to any historic character. So at this stage, I've got a green belt which fits none of the green belt purposes within the green belt requirements of the framework, and I've got none of the special character either. So I've got a green belt, which is actually effectively a green wedge in the description of the annex. And I think the point being is that this perhaps demonstrates that the point that I made yesterday is I think the council has got carried away with its green belt assessment. And then there's one final point, sir, and I'm pleased that there are 2 inspectors.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Yes. How shall I put this? When one looks even briefly at ST7 and 8 on a plan, in plan form, they appear to have a curious relationship, or at least I should put that the other way around, really. I suppose one's mind is drawn to the extent to which the land, which I think I've referred to as a wedge of greenbelt, would perform the greenbelt purposes, hence referring in this question specifically to ST7 and ST8. I think for today's purposes, what I want to establish is whether that's a methodological, an outcome of the method, or whether it's about its application, or both. In essence, I'm checking that that's not the outcome of a flawed method. You're looking puzzled, Mr. Johnson.
No, sir, I just wondered if you wanted me to continue, or that was you asking a question of the council. I think it's the application of a flawed method in the sense that I've ended up with I think what the council was originally intending was a green wedge, but I've ended up with a green belt. And I think that's where the problem lies, is that they've got carried away with the green belt assessment.
You see, when you say carried away, it's difficult to know whether they've got carried away with a perfectly good method, and that's led them to, as you might suggest, the wrong answer, or whether they've got carried away with a fundamentally flawed method, and that's led them, as you would say, to the wrong answer.
I think my point yesterday, sir, and it's the same again today, is that it's the combination of looking at the requirements for development growth, and ultimately those ought not to have been greenbelt areas, and I think that's where the error lies. And I think we've got these protection zones for existing settlements, which are not necessarily greenbelt. And no doubt we will come to those in the stage 2 hearings. And I think my other point was going to be on heritage and views of the Minster. And I was going to say, sir, I'm glad that there are 2 inspectors, because when you are viewing these sites from the bypass, is that one of you will be driving at 70 miles an hour whilst the other one is taking the opportunity to glimpse sideways.
60 miles an hour. I do not want a speeding ticket.
Mr. Willis.
Thank you, sir. It's just a very quick one, really. Looking at the document Annex 5, it's EXCYC 18B, goes through the various sites that have been allocated and considers their contribution to Greenbelt, amongst other things. What I'd just like to highlight is, and it's in my statement, paragraph 4.789, is that there's a lack of a similar assessment for sites which have been in the plan previously or have been safeguarded previously. I would put it to you, sir, that many of the sites which are now allocated in this document fall within 2 or 3 of the constraints, whereas certainly, without getting site specific, my site certainly doesn't fall within that many. I would suggest it's a better alternative in that regard. I'm sure there are others as well, but it's just, it's that, in my mind, it's that flaw that where is the equivalent assessment for sites which have not found their way into the plan or were previously in the plan but have been dropped.
My apologies, I'm not quite sure that I've followed that. I think you're suggesting that there are areas of land that have been considered by the council but not assessed in the same way. Have I got that right?
Yes, sorry. So, without getting too site specific, the site that we have in Earswick was in a previous version of the plan. Clearly has been assessed to some extent, but I think it dropped out of the plan in 2013-14 when the safeguarded sites disappeared. My view is that those sites, certainly my site at least, doesn't have as many of the constraints as some of the sites which are identified in this EXC 18B, CYC 18B, sorry. And I think it's a bit of a flaw. It's a lack of consideration of alternatives not to undertake that same assessment for those
so
sites.
what assessment are you referring to?
It's the, so if you've got it there, sir, it's Annex 5.
I don't have that immediately to hand, I don't think.
I'm probably looking at plans, so I've got it visually, whereas you obviously haven't.
What's the page reference, please?
You could turn to any of them, but the first one is consideration of site ST7 on A5.2.
Yep.
I'm not too concerned about which site in particular we look at. My point is quite simply that many of the sites in here are constrained by 2 or more of those identified constraints. There are many others which could have been allocated which don't have that same number of constraints. And seemingly haven't been assessed in the same way.
So that's not about absence of assessment, it's about consistency, is it? Consistency of outcome.
I would say it's one and the same, really. There is an absence of assessment of those missing sites, but in that respect, it's not consistent. So.
I'm really sorry. I'm not following. I'm just not following. And I want to understand because it's potentially important. What hasn't been assessed that should have been?
Quite simply, sir, my view is that sites, I'll give you the reference for ease, 810 was a previous safeguarded site in the plan, and others, I'm sure, have not
Sorry,
been...
A10 did you say?
810.
Oh, right, okay.
Have not been assessed in the same way as this. Therefore, there are sites, including 810, which don't have the same number of constraints and are arguably more appropriate to be allocated at this stage than the sites in this document.
What I'm trying to get clear in my mind is whether you're saying that there are sites that the council knows about but hasn't put through the methodology.
They certainly know about it because we've made representations about it, and following that through, I don't think they have been put through the same methodology now.
Mr. Linus, I'm not going to ask you to reply just yet. I just want to check that you fully understand Mr. Willis's point. I don't know if I'm just exceptionally slow this afternoon, but I haven't got as firm a grip on the point as I would like to have. I'm hoping that you have and can enlighten me in due course.
Sir, for now, can I say that I think we understand the point to be that Mr. Willis's site he's complaining hasn't been assessed in the same way as the sites in Annex 5. And the short answer to it goes back to our overview at the beginning, because it's important to see the overall approach to sites within the wider site selection process that the Council has undertaken through the SLA as well. And as I said at the outset, the approach to the SLA has embedded the same spatial principles that were taken into account as part of the Greenbelt assessment. So that linkage is an important starting point. And the sites that have been presented to the Council, including those which have ended up being identified in Annex 5, went through the same site selection process, and the overall process included the preferred sites consultation and a pre-publication consultation. Each of which followed the SLA methodology, which had embedded the principles that I've referred to. So that methodology included all sites that had been presented, including sites which were dropped and sites which ended up in Annex 5. So we would say...
So as part of the process, there were some sites filtered out?
Yes, through the SLA process, which embedded the Greenbelt principles in the way I've identified, some sites were filtered out. Some were filtered out on grounds including pure access to transport, because it's one of the SLA criteria. Others were filtered out on Greenbelt grounds. But there was a filtering process where all the sites were considered. So we say that all sites were considered on a comparative basis, even though ultimately the justification for the sites to be released has been presented in a more detailed form come Annex 5. But the overall site selection process has looked at both the Annex 5 sites and other sites together, according to the same criteria. I hope that understands the question and gives an answer to it.
Just before I move on, yes, is that the issue that you were referring to, Mr. Willis?
Yes, so I think Mr. McCormack caught me here agreeing as well. It is quite simply that my site has not been assessed in the same way as those. Exactly that. I think it should have been. The council obviously put its reasons to why it didn't need to. I think that's where the difference is.
We're saying we did rather than we didn't need to.
I can't really add much more to that, sir, other than personally it probably should have been in a document presented the same as this, but if the evidence is there, then the evidence is there. For clarity, I think it should have been in that kind of document.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Barnes.
Thank you, sir. I'm just going to park my comments I made yesterday about the Greenbelt assessment and the methodology behind that. We've already discussed that yesterday. I think it should be recognised that this plan was prepared over quite an extensive period of time, and things evolve and change over time. And so we've welcomed the opportunity to engage with the council and their consideration of site-specific evidence, which not only on our site, I think that's fairly clear, on several other sites allocated in the plan, which, or draft allocated in the plan rather, which allows for more detailed consideration of issues which borough or district-wide assessments can't capture. And I think these are important on Greenbelt. Evidence that's being produced in relation to our site, for example, not just by us, by the local community as well. Consider issues of landscape quality, openness and visual impact, recreational value, historical value in terms of the past, how land around the settlement relates to why that settlement exists, the character of that land as well. The problem is that I don't think Annex 5 or the wider evidence base of the plan adequately reflects that evidence. So I don't think the paper trail is there, which shows you how they've got from the site, the primary assessment made up front to the allocation of the sites and the assessed level of harm that's in that Greenbelt assessment.
Ms. Winter.
Thank you, sir. I think the unsupported sites that Mr Willis is referring to are the sites that were filtered out in advance of the Greenbelt review. So as it stands, it's whether or not that's robust or not. Thank you.
Yeah. Is that right?
Can I just clarify what specifically you mean by the Greenbelt review?
TP1.
May 2018?
Yes.
TP1. TP1 paper was a presentation of information that had started from 2003 and had been updated in terms of historic character, open space, and other factors over 2011, 2013. That was presenting the work that's specifically been done on Greenbelt as a whole. But the point that I think the Council is making is that the site selection process has to be aligned with that. And the site selection process, even before that stage of the Greenbelt review paper, the Greenbelt Topic 1 paper in May 2018, had embedded the same spatial principles at an earlier stage and had conducted a site selection process that took into account those principles. So although that document of May 2018 summarised the wider approach to Greenbelt, Greenbelt principles had still been embedded into the site selection process at an earlier stage. So it wasn't as if everything started at May 2018. The process that I've identified beforehand has already taken into account Greenbelt purposes through site selection.
Mr. Lane.
Thank you, sir. You'll recall yesterday that I made a point about the parcel boundary treatment that the council had undertaken, and that they didn't know whether the land outside of the city itself performed any, needed to be kept permanently open. That assessment hadn't been done. The council pointed me in the response last thing yesterday to Annex 4 of TP1. Annex 4 of TP1 simply draws a line tightly around these other settlements and then describes the boundaries. They don't assess those boundaries or the parcels that adjoin those boundaries. The council then, to justify their stance, sir, pointed me in the direction of paragraph 86 of the NPPF, which, as I'm sure you're aware, deals with whether or not settlements should be inset or washed over in the Greenbelt, and not the approach as to defining boundaries. And on that basis, it's my view that outside of the main city, the council simply don't know what land needs to be kept permanently open or not.
Yeah. On that, Mr. Lane, you're talking, I think, about inset villages, aren't you? And potentially, I don't know, but villages that aren't inset.
Inset villages, let's just say Weldrake, for example, a village that's inset, the council just simply don't know what parcels of land around Weldrake need to be kept permanently open or not.
Yeah. That isn't the intention of this question.
No.
It is something that we have had in our minds to look at in phase 2.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Your point isn't lost. It's just that it's not something that we're going to look at today. That is just heads up to the council. Yeah, that there are various reasons why we haven't picked that up in phase 1, which I don't think I need to go into now.
Isn't it a
I'm
methodology
not
point,
going to go into now. Sorry?
Isn't it a methodology point, though, sir? E.g., the methodology is not robust.
It is a methodology point, but the questions that we've set out here are aimed at, well, I know it says identifying land to be released from the Greenbelt. Well, it's for development rather than being about, for example, the inset villages. So you're looking puzzled.
Well, there's some big villages, and in fact towns like Haxby, sir. So it's not we're not talking about small, insignificant settlements. There are some big areas.
I hadn't overlooked them. We haven't set specific questions about those villages for phase 1. We've kept that back as a phase 2 matter.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
But fear not, Mr. Lane, it's not something that will be lost. You look rather worried now. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, sir. Yesterday, when we were talking about other aspects of the Greenbelt, I said that in order to be able to define a Greenbelt boundaries which are likely to fulfill its primary purpose, it was first necessary to understand the elements that contribute to York's special character and setting. And the Council did that work and set it out in the Heritage Topic Paper. And then as an aside, actually, it's quite interesting to note how many of the elements the Council identified actually replicate those identified by the earlier local plan inspector, but that's by the by. So, sir, it seems appropriate, therefore, for the Council to use that work in order to evaluate the extent to which the sites they're bringing forward through the plan are likely to conform with or harm the elements that they have identified as contribution to York's historic character and setting. So in terms of a general approach, I think it's a very sound way of going about it. However, we do have concerns about its application. It's not a fault with the methodology, it's the fault with the way it's been applied, and that is evidenced, I think, certainly in sites ST7 and ST8. And I think, as I said yesterday, the fact that the Heritage Topic Paper didn't actually result in any changes to Figure 7, which set out the strategic areas which contribute to York's special historic character and setting, have actually been fed through into Annex 4 and Annex 5 spatially. And I think, so the actual approach that they're set out by using the Heritage Topic Paper is I think, very, very robust. It's just that some of its application isn't so.
Mr. Vernon.
Thank you. I just wanted to build upon the points made by Mr. Willis and Ms. Winter. And again, the best way of doing that in our case is with regards to a specific site, for which I apologise. But in our case, we are not aware of an assessment, never mind whether it's been a similar assessment to that of other sites. I can't even give you a site reference number. And that's particularly surprising given that our site has been considered formally as an employment allocation, and its current planning status is that of white land, which was resulting from a neighbourhood plan which was made up as long ago as October 2017. So it again, unless the council can give accurate evidence of that process, it feels as though this is a process that's being very much backfilled to suit a particular random spatial strategy.
Mr. Natkus.
Thank you. So I've got a vested interest in finishing today because it's our Christmas drinks tomorrow, so I'll be very quick in terms of it. In terms of A, B and C, we touched on these yesterday, I think, in terms of the openness, and I would just quickly say that as yesterday, we're not doing the normal assessment of Greenbelt assessment and releasing land from it. We are looking at boundaries, particularly in the inner area, and we're also looking at setting the Greenbelt for the first time, which I, for one, have not done in a local plan examination. I appreciate some of the people around the table may have done. But I think that figure 7 has to be read as part of the evidence as a whole, and it has to be read with the other documents and also the strategy document, and simply saying, well, actually, there's large areas to the west where it doesn't have an impact on openness, so all the housing should go there, doesn't fit with the strategy. Now, again, some people say, well, you would say that because that doesn't meet yours, but we've actually promoted land at Copnamthorpe, so it does. But ultimately, just to suddenly say we should put all of the housing there doesn't necessarily meet with the most sustainable ways of doing it. And I think the council have had to balance that, and that's how we have to look at this, and that's what the plan does. In terms of your questions D and E, these relate to the purposes of Greenbelt, and this is what I want to focus on a little bit more, because it asks about those purposes, and particularly the ones to do with the character of the historic city. And I think we do just need to have a proportionate approach to this, and look at the evidence that's in front of us. There's a lot of comments on old documents and old evidence bases, but ultimately it's again what is in front of us and what are we looking at. And an awful lot has changed since the late 80s when we're talking about other inspectors' reports and things like that. From my perspective, I think, as I said yesterday, the methodology is fine in terms of the strategic approach. And TP1A shows us this in terms of identifying, and with regard to ST7, because it's in your question, this is a site a little bit like ST8, where it's been pulled away from it and left with this thin strip of new greenbelt between it. And when you go through the strategic assessment, there is no need whatsoever for that strip of land. There's no need. You look at it and it identifies that it's an area that doesn't have any purpose contribution to the greenbelt. What then seems to have happened, though, as with the site I discussed yesterday, is that the next stage is to go on to local assessment, and somebody's walked the site and then felt from walking the site that there needs to be a buffer between the existing residential development and the new scheme. Now, that might be the case, but that doesn't mean it has to be Greenbelt. And I think that's what we have to be really careful about with doing this, that because somebody's looked at that site and thought there should be a buffer, and ST8's another one when you see that, should that land stay as Greenbelt? Is that thin slither of land actually contributing to a Greenbelt purpose? I haven't seen any evidence in any of the supporting documents or Annex 5 that shows that that's the case. It gives a reason why they believe there should be a buffer, and it mentions things such as green wedges, but again, a green wedge is very different to Greenbelt. And there's no reason why other development control mechanisms can't be used. I think we have to be really careful that Greenbelt doesn't become this default position of dealing with other more sensitive matters. So it would be very simple, for example, for ST7 to have its original red line, for the land not to be in the green belt, but then actually for that policy to then require a buffer. And then this land can actually be used for landscaping, it could be used for drainage, it could be used for open space. You would result in exactly the same position that we have, but you wouldn't have this odd slither of green belt that has no purpose being greenbelt whatsoever. So I think that's where we have to be really, really careful about this and ensure that those boundaries are out. I know we will talk about them in phase 2, but just whilst we're looking at the purposes, I think that actually it doesn't comply, and at present it's unsound because of that stage 2 local assessment and how that's been interpreted.
When in due course the council comes to reply, it's going to help me to know whether, as part of the method deployed here, other mechanisms of the sort just mentioned by Mr. Natkus have, how should I put it, systemically been considered through the process, or whether the answer has been immediately to leap to Greenbelt. Mrs. Hubbard.
Yes, thank you. I've got so far without mentioning specific sites, so I'll try and keep to that. Whatever conclusion you come to about the adequacy of the individual site assessments on a site-by-site basis, what you haven't had, so far as I'm aware, what the council hasn't produced is a comparative assessment. So we don't know, for example, whether the development of a site which would have an impact on views of the Minster, is more or less acceptable than the development of a site which would lead to coalescence. Now, I appreciate that this would be a very difficult job to do, but there is no league table, there never has been a league table of sites which could be developed causing no harm or the least harm, down to the ones that would cause some identified harm, but we have to allocate them to make our housing numbers. So there's no basis no published basis, so far as I'm aware, to show how the council came to remove sites, which we call the emissions, well, I'll call the emission sites that have been in an earlier version of the plan, and sites that are currently in the plan but have had their boundaries reduced. There's no comparative assessment and no justification for why those sites have been deallocated. And it usually falls to me at these sort of occasions to say the unacceptable things, but Councillor Waters has said it this time. The process, I believe, by which sites were changed or omitted was based on a rather arbitrary process of horse trading in the council, which is fair enough. I mean, these things happen. But the point of this is that at least some of the emission sites ticked all the SE boxes, all the Greenbelt issues, and were fully supported by officers. And that's why I hope I'm not disadvantaging my clients by not being site-specific at this stage, but I do think it means you have to allow the fullest discussion of the merits of these sites in phase 2 if we get there. Thank you.
Mr. Butler.
Thank you, sir. My point is more of an application point, I suppose, is the way of phrasing it. The criticisms you've heard about the site that is commonly used for illustrative purposes, which is ST14, is an application point. And to a large extent, we agree, because of all those criticisms can be overcome by expanding the site in the manner we propose as part of our options. I'll leave that point there. Which have all been assessed in 2013 through the sustainability appraisal. And I think that point goes back to a lot of the discussion that's taken place about the consideration of alternative options. They are there in the evidence base. Going back to your questions, which would be like to hear, I just wanted to go back onto 3.7 A, B, C and E and refer you to section 4 of our statements, because we obviously make comments on that specifically on the purposes and specifically on openness, which will lead nicely onto phase 2 in due course. But that was my comments. Thank you.
Mr. Corsier, apologies. I should know better.
Thank you, sir. Very briefly, I want to come back on the point, on the answer which Mr. Linus gave to Ms. Winter on the methodology. I'm sticking to methodology. He said that the Greenbelt purposes of individual sites had been assessed throughout the process, and I accept that, sir. I'm not going to argue with that point. However, what hasn't been done, or hadn't been done at that time, and right up to post-publication, there had been no attempt to look at the broad areas of land within the beyond the urban perimeter as to which broad areas fulfill which functions. And that, sir, is very important. You can take any individual piece of land, sir, and you can say, always make an argument why it should or shouldn't fulfill Greenbelt functions, purposes. It's only when you look at the totality of, strategic areas that you could come to a full judgment on that matter. And that is where the site selection process leading up to the submission draft is faulty. Because, of course, TP1 addendum are both both post-publication pieces of evidence. Indeed, TP1 addendum is a post-submission piece of evidence which PINS would say would tend to indicate should not occur in the guidance. And so we say that that makes the absence of the type of information in the TP1 addendum. We disagree with it, sir, but that type of evidence should have been fundamental to the site selection process. And without it, sir, proper judgments could not be made. And so that is what has led to such a faulty selection of sites. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Grundy.
Thank you, and a very small point to hopefully conclude on. We say that a full reconsideration of all sites, all options in covering emission sites was needed when the Council's direction of travel in terms of site allocation took place, backed by a Greenbelt review at that time. Perhaps those failures point in no small part to the Council's desire to rush a plan in before the deadline and be considered under the old rules rather than the new rules.
Okay, I'm going to take an adjournment now. The time is 3:36. I adjourn the hearing to resume at 3:15. Thank you.
4:15.
Apologies. 4:15.